forests because of our cold winters. But that could change. Many of our remote northern communities depend on winter roads as their only economically viable transportation link to the south. Some of these roads may not be passable in a warmer climate. And so far, the cold has helped impede the northward progress of this mosquito species that carries the Zika virus. One last point is that heat is a form of energy. And anytime you add more energy into a system, you increase its energy level. Our atmosphere works the same way. A warmer atmosphere will become more unstable and produce more frequent and more intense storms. Under a warmer climate, it's quite conceivable that the tornado alley that currently extends from Texas to South Dakota will migrate up into southern Saskatchewan. Under a warmer climate, we can also expect to see more frequent occurrences of droughts and floods. And although we've had some very dry and very wet years in recent past, the droughts and floods we can expect to see in the future may last for 5 years or more. As I noted at the outset, there's no doubt that the Earth now is warmer than it was 100 years ago. And studies have shown that this rise in heat energy is creating instability in the global atmospheric system. We're already seeing more extreme weather events around the world. Think of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma from earlier this year. So Vic, global warming is happening. We are the cause by releasing more and more carbon in the atmosphere. This will have significant impacts on the people, environment, and economy of Saskatchewan.
Thank you. So we will move on to our next panelist, Samuel Gantessa. So just a little bit of background for him. So he earned his PhD in economics from the University of Alberta not very long ago. And he has been with the economics department here at UofR with us since 2013. So his research interests include energy efficiency and climate change policies. He has published in multiple outlets, including Energy Efficiency Journal, Canadian Public Policy, Energy and Building, and many other journals. So my question to you, Sam, is, now that we've heard Joe's talk, and we know that global warming seems to be real, and we people have lots to do with it, so what can governments do to curb greenhouse gas emissions? What policies are available to the government?
Okay, thank you. I'll present the basic economic arguments for policies in order to address pollution problems. What Joe just presented is a problem of global warming, which is a global externality problem. Externality in basic economics is something that decision-making units don't care about. Households, businesses don't care about their pollution. Therefore, it's up to the government to intervene with some policy instruments in order to force actions required to make the desired change. So I'll highlight this issue in general. One key problem with this global warming problem is it's not a local externality, it's a global externality problem. What this means is pollution elsewhere affects or damages everywhere. So our action here has benefits everywhere else across the globe. Or actions taken elsewhere will affect us as well. So this has very important implications for the policies. For example, when we are introducing policies are costly, we are willing to pay that cost, but because there is no restriction from others from enjoying these benefits, they might free ride. They may not want to do anything. On the other hand, the fact that they are not doing anything means that we will be at a competitive disadvantage in the international trade market. Our economy suffers. So there are these problems. There is the free ridership problem, and there is therefore in the end, it's possible that nobody will act. So that's why there is a global body that is trying to bring all countries together to have a concerted effort. The policy approach we recommend in economics is that if it is a carbon tax, we have to eventually look for a harmonized carbon tax across the globe. That means a pollution, every polluter has to pay the same amount per unit of pollution wherever it is. Those are the more general issues that we have, or why it's very difficult to have these policies implemented and so on. I'll briefly discuss the major policy options we have in economics. Emission tax is one of the most prominent one. We have others such as tradable emission allowances or trade approach, subsidies for any abatement efforts, as well as direct controls such as what we call performance standards, meaning capping emission, which is very costly to implement, of course, because it requires monitoring and making sure that everybody meets the standard. So these are the general policy instruments. How do we compare? When we want to pick one, we have to compare these policy instruments across along some basic criteria. The first basic criteria is what we call the efficiency criterion, which is basically the cost-benefit type criterion, wherein we pick a policy which generates the maximum net benefit. The problem here is then we can't calculate the net benefit accurately, because net benefit requires us to estimate the cost and the benefit. The benefit is the benefit is estimated by the amount of damage that we avoid when we take policy actions. And how do we estimate that? That's very difficult. Number one, the second one is that benefit is actually a global benefit. So we're talking about the local policy actions based on benefits accrued everywhere else. So the efficiency criterion is very difficult, but policymakers consider what is known as the social cost of carbon. If you look at the Environment Canada's website, you'll find some numerical estimates known as the social cost of carbon, which would indicate that that is the amount of per unit benefit we generate when we reduce emission by 1 unit. So we just pick that number and compare the per unit cost implied by the policy action. Based on that, you can check if the policy is efficient or not. The second important and most commonly used is what we call the cost effectiveness criterion. The cost effectiveness basically says that everybody has to pay the same amount per unit. So every polluter should pay the same amount of per unit pollution. So in Saskatchewan, everyone has to pay the same amount of money per unit of pollution emitted. That means you can see carbon tax immediately meets this standard. Cap and trade also meets this standard. So that is the minimum criterion we need for a policy to be considered. And other types of policies usually fail on this criterion, but the choice is always difficult. We are not going to pick just one policy instrument. Usually, this issue requires introducing a set of policies. For example, we can introduce carbon tax, but carbon tax alone may not be effective unless we also use other incentives for actions such as purchase of fuel-efficient vehicles and so on. So we have to combine different policy instruments in order to achieve a better result. I'll conclude. I'll come back later if there are more questions. I'll conclude by showing some generalizations in the literature of economics. Generally, we have up to 50% cost advantage over other types of policies if we introduce carbon tax. So carbon tax is the preferred policy instrument compared to others. So if the authorities in any jurisdiction want to address this issue, carbon tax is the most preferred policy instrument.
That's great. So the second question will be related to what Sam just said, and this question will be for Brad. So, and I will just briefly introduce Brad Dolter. So he's an economist specializing in climate and energy policy research. He has published in journals such as Energy Policy and Ecological Economics. He's done lots for his education. So he completed his PhD degree at York University. He holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Victoria and a master's in resource management and environmental studies from UBC. That's lots of studying. In between these degrees, Brett worked as a senior policy analyst for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Green Policy Unit, and most recently he held a research fellowship at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Environment, and he's now a postdoctoral research fellow in the University of Regina's Faculty of Arts, where he is affiliated with the Economics Department and Geography and Environmental Studies Department. So my question to you, Brad, is, so if we were to implement, so Sam just mentioned that carbon tax and cap and trade would be good policies to start with. So if we were to implement a carbon tax in Saskatchewan, how big should it be? Have other provinces in Canada done anything in this respect? And if yes, can Saskatchewan learn any lessons from those?
Thanks. Yeah. So thanks, Nick, and thanks for having me on the panel. I wanted to answer that question, and just as a bit of a preamble, touch on a few points that Sam and I discussed. Maybe I touch on the value of carbon pricing. But first I wanted to ask, so when we talk about carbon pricing, we probably start and get a sense of people's feelings on the issue by having you answer two questions. You don't have to say them out loud, your answers, but if you think about your answers to these two questions, one, is climate change an urgent problem? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Okay, you said yes to that. Okay, so you could say yes to that, you could say no to that. Second one, is getting the world off fossil fuels difficult?
Absolutely. Depending on the fuel, depending on the location.
So if you're all in that camp, you're probably going to be on board then in us looking at, well, how do we do this then? This is a challenge, and this is a generational challenge. When you think about right now, the world's trying to meet this 2 degrees Celsius target. That means if you look at the projections, we need to get to near zero emissions by mid-century. If we don't get there by mid-century, we have to think about these technologies to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's huge. There's ways to get there. The sort of shortcut version of the explanation is you've got to decarbonize electricity and you've got to electrify everything. If you have clean electricity, then you can use electricity for your transportation, for your industry. So those two things make up part of the strategy. Carbon pricing is a lever to help move us in those directions. And you can think of, if we get this giant boulder that is the need to act, and climate policy and carbon pricing is a lever that is going to get bigger over time. So we start with a little tiny lever and we can't really move that boulder, and if we really try to move it too quickly, we might break it. But over time, we're adding the prices going up, we can move bigger and bigger boulders with that price lever. And we know that it's a capital stock turnover problem as well. So we know that, and your report mentions this, that we need to think about people making investments when it makes sense on climate change action. So if I just put in a new furnace, and this is an example from your report, I don't think I necessarily need to go buy a better furnace tomorrow, but maybe in 20 years I think about that. So that's some things to consider when you think about this climate change problem. Now, Sam outline some of the theory for why economists generally like carbon pricing. And you look at, some people have done surveys and they found 80 to, sometimes surveys say 100% of economists, depending on how you word the question, are supportive of carbon pricing. So we're big fans of it, and trying to convince you why you should be big fans of it. So some of the reasons why you might like carbon pricing. So when you put a price on carbon, people have to respond not only to the price on the direct emissions, so if you're driving a car, not only the price on the gasoline you're burning, but also the indirect emissions, all those emissions related to building the car that you're driving. So that all gets put into the price. It allows for differences between polluters. If you have a regulation that requires you to respond in one way, some industries may not be able to respond cheaply. So if you have a carbon price, and you're an industry where it would take you $500 a ton to reduce your emissions, you might not reduce your emissions, you pay the carbon price. If you're an industry that takes $10 a ton to reduce emissions, well, you take that action, you reduce emissions. And this means over time this is efficient. This is what Sam was talking about. From a kind of individual perspective, it's a policy that maximizes individual freedom. So you have the choice of whether, this is a tax you can decide whether you want to pay by deciding whether you're going to use the fuels that contain these emissions. You could go out and choose to buy the biggest, most polluting vehicle you want, but what we're saying is with carbon price, you have to pay the social cost of the results of that. So you're free to do it, it's just going to cost you more. And if you decide you're going to bike every day, well, you don't pay those costs. It's a tax you don't have to pay. It also provides a continuous incentive for innovation. So Sam had mentioned the efficiency of carbon price versus regulation. If you have a regulation, there's a danger that you meet the standard and then that's it. You just sort of get stuck there. With a carbon price, every ton you emit, there's an incentive not to emit it. So there's a continuous incentive to reduce those emissions. So you can ask me more about that if you'd like. And so another benefit is you limit energy rebound. Is anyone familiar with this idea of a rebound effect or Jevons paradox? Anybody? Okay, it's the idea that if you buy a more efficient car, it has now become less expensive to drive. And so you might react by driving more, by driving further, because you're getting further with the same tank of gas. By putting a price on carbon, you ensure that rebound effect doesn't happen, that when you get more efficient, you don't consume more. Sam mentioned this need to have a global carbon price. So the big concern with carbon pricing is leakage. If you have a carbon price in Saskatchewan, you don't have one in the States, industry moves to the States. So ideally, you would want to have that same policy, that same level of stringency across the whole world. Now, if you don't have it, there are ways to deal with that. So yesterday at COP in Bonn, the Conference of the Parties, there's all these world leaders now meeting in Bonn, Germany to discuss climate change. President of France, Macron, suggested that if the EU is acting and places like the United States are not acting, they should put up a border adjustment tax. So if you try to sell a product into the EU and you don't have a carbon price, you actually have to pay that carbon price at the gate. So that's a way to enforce a carbon price on jurisdictions that don't already have it. And economists talk about that as having a carbon club, a group of countries that all have agreed to put in carbon pricing. They trade freely amongst themselves. If you're not in that carbon club, well, we're going to have a hammer waiting at the door when you try to sell your goods to us because they're artificially cheap. There's a couple more things I'll say, but the last thing I'll say on the reasons why it's the right kind of lever. As economists, we think people are more motivated by their pocketbook, unfortunately, in many cases, than some sense of altruism. Now, that may not always be true. If you really care about climate change, you might want to act. But there'll be some people out there who don't really think about the environmental implications of what car they choose to drive. And so carbon pricing helps to put that into a framework where they can think about it. Now, as we think about designing a carbon price in Canada, we can learn from what other jurisdictions have done. The place that pioneered carbon pricing in Canada is BC. They put in a carbon price in 2008 at $10 a ton. It rose to $30 a ton by 2012, and then it stopped there. Research that's been done on the BC experience, that carbon price allowed them to reduce emissions relative to what they would have been while their population grew, while their economy grew. When that carbon price paused, emissions started to grow again. So this is a sign that one design consideration is you need to keep that price rising over time. That pressure has to keep increasing.
Does that have to include the rate of inflation?
Sorry
for interrupting.
Yeah, I mean it could. It's a good idea. It's a good idea if it thinks about inflation. Yeah. And now, so if we want to use a carbon price to meet our targets, so right now the nationally determined contribution, what Canada has said they'll do, we need to as a country get to 523 megatons by 2030, 30% reduction from 2005 levels. So to get there, some of the models say we'll need a carbon price of $100 to $150 per ton. What does that mean for gasoline? $150 a ton means an extra 33 cents a liter. So it starts to be something you can see, you can feel. The size of how much you need depends on how many other policies you put in place to help out, to complementary policies. But the thing that's always important to remember is when you have people paying this money, and I'm sure you're going to talk more about this, that money doesn't just disappear. We still have that revenue. We can use it to address the issues that carbon pricing might cause. Two of the issues we have to think about: equity. So how does carbon pricing impact households that don't have a lot of money, households in circumstances they're rural, they have to drive? So how does carbon pricing influence or impact those households? Or how does carbon pricing impact industries that have to compete globally, these trade-exposed industries? So the good thing is if you have a carbon price, you get all this revenue you can use to help alleviate those impacts. You can give money back to the households that are low income. This is what Alberta is doing. They have a means-tested carbon rebate. So they're giving rebates if you're a family of four making $95,000 or less, or anyone making $95,000 or less, you're getting checks that are going to be more than you're paying as a household in direct carbon costs. For industry, you can think about what Alberta has done and now what the federal government says that provinces who don't take action will have to do. Saskatchewan will have to do this if we don't come up with our own plan. For industry is an output-based allocation. So you require that industry meets a target, a performance target, that is based on their industry, it's based on best in their class, and if they don't meet that performance target, any emissions above that target they have to pay for. This means they're not paying for every ton of emissions, so that the impact on their bottom line is less, but there still is that incentive for them to improve. And if they beat their target, they get credits they can sell. So there's that incentive to beat the target and actually make some money by being the cleanest industry or cleanest facility in your industry. A few more things and then I'll wrap up here. So other things we can learn from. It seems that for political, I'm not a political scientist, but I think I know that if you make a policy revenue neutral, it's going to help people accept it. It's people don't like to see sometimes people talk about carbon tax as a tax grab. If it can be that, if you're taking the money and using it for some pet projects people don't believe in, but if you take the money and give it back to people, it might be more likely to get politically accepted. So that could be in the form of tax cuts, and that's what BC has done. They actually have in legislation all of the revenue that they gather because of their carbon price has to be given back in the form of tax cuts to the people in BC. So they've decreased the tax rates in their lower two income tax brackets by 5%. They award rebates to people in rural areas. They give all the money back, and in fact, they've given more money back through those actions than they've taken in. So it's actually not revenue neutral; it's revenue negative in BC. They've actually kind of overspent their carbon revenues. But that's part of the reason why the economic impact is not so high there. The other thing that I will say is that if you don't go with pricing, there's two things to think about here in Saskatchewan. One is that alternative policies still have costs. And so we know the one thing that we've done here in Saskatchewan that we could say this has reduced emissions is the Boundary Dam Unit 3 carbon capture and storage. We look at the cost of building that unit, what the implied carbon price would be. So that's the carbon price that would have been necessary for that investment to be worth more or cost less than just having a conventional plant running and emitting all those emissions. So that's around $60 a ton carbon capture with CCS on coal versus conventional coal. If you compare carbon capture with CCS to natural gas combined cycle plant, you actually need a carbon price of $250 a ton in order to justify that investment. So it's an expensive investment. We don't necessarily see it as a carbon tax because it's hidden from view. The cost of that shows up on your electricity bills. You don't necessarily know, well, that's from Boundary Dam Unit 3 that bill has gone up. But the costs are there. They just may not be obvious, and they may be sort of arbitrary. Why pick that project when there might have been many other cheaper ways to reduce emissions in the province? The other thing, Saskatchewan's an interesting place though. If we decided we don't want to go with pricing, we can actually look at the large emitters. There are 44 facilities in Saskatchewan that emit a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. And they're owned by 24 companies. So we can work with 24 companies. 3 of those are Crowns, SaskPower, SaskEnergy, TransGas. 2 are landfills, one's University of Saskatchewan. So we've got 18 private companies to work with to reduce 1/3 of our provincial emissions. So if we don't go with pricing, then we can have maybe just this sort of industry to province relationship, and maybe it is possible in a small place like Saskatchewan to avoid pricing, just work with industry. We're lucky enough that we're a little bigger than some places. So just last example, PEI had considered a cap and trade program for their province. Then they realized there was only one industry that was big enough to fit in that program. So they decided that wasn't going to work. There's nobody to trade with. It's just a cap. But anyway, so those are my thoughts. I have more, but I'll let it pass over to Jim here to talk about their research, and happy to take questions.
Great, so we're going to move on to our last panelist, Jim Marshall. So Jim Marshall has been with the GSGS, Johnson Shiyama Graduate School of Public Policy in a variety of capacities, including as an executive in residence and as a lecturer in public finance in the school was created. Prior to coming to Saskatchewan, Jim Marshall lectured in economics at Brandon University and conducted research at the Library of Parliament in Ottawa. He also served in the federal and provincial government for 37 years, occupying senior policy and executive positions in the Department of Finance and Industry and Resources and in the Crown Investments Corporation. His research interests include public policy and public administration, and of course the big wide questions that we want to know the answers to. So my question to you, Jim, is, so after we've heard all of this, so whenever there's a discussion about carbon tax, so usually this discussion evolves around the impact on the industry. But the idea behind carbon tax is to make sure that consumers, all of us, change our behavior. And since each individual person, each of us, considers themselves like a small, very tiny polluter, will there be enough incentives for people to change their behavior? Will a carbon tax affect or help us change people's behavior and become lesser polluters?
Okay. Thanks, Victoria. I'm going to have a few pictures to show you. So I guess the reason I was invited here today was because very recently Johnson Shiyama Graduate School of Public Policy, I have to mention them, published a paper called Saskatchewan and Climate Change, the Challenges, Policy Options, and Implications. And there were a number of us on the team that worked on this paper, and the good ones couldn't make it today, so they sent me. But I want to show you some pictures as we go. So first, we'll work with this. So I dug up this chart of historical oil prices. It goes back 70 years. About half my lifespan. And I want to pick out a couple of key points. January 1974, when oil reached $54 a barrel roughly. April 1980, when oil was a whopping $120 a barrel. These are U.S. dollars per per barrel. And June 2008, that was a good year, $158 per barrel. In June 2008. So it's had ups and downs. It was pretty flat for a long time till somewhere around about the mid-1970s, and then you'll see the kind of peaks and that sort of thing. So I had a look at some of the other things that happened along the way, and I'll show you something that most of you have probably never seen. This is a General Motors big block V8.
I built one of those.
It was around from 1970 to 1976, okay? 454 lovely cubic inches of engine, right? The 1974 Chevrolet Corvette got 8 to 13 miles per gallon with one of these things in it, all right? I had a friend that had one of those big monster Buicks. Well, her father had this big monster Buick. You could put maybe 2 of them in this room. And it got 8 miles to the gallon. Those were Canadian gallons. These are U.S. gallons. So you've seen that. And there, you love this one, Plymouth Barracuda, 1964 to 1974. Lovely lime green. This is a 340 on the picture, but the big one had a 440 cubic inch RB V8 in it in 1970-71. 7 to 12 miles per gallon from that car. The Ford Mustang, not these new ones, but this is the first generation real Mustangs, right? 1965 to 73, at its height, 428 cubic inches in a V8 Super Cobra jet. Got 11 miles per gallon. I'm using miles per gallon because they hadn't invented that metric stuff yet then. And this is the Dodge Super Bee. Loved this. 1968 to 1980, 383 cubic inches. Again, smaller, but it's still up there. V8 Magnum in the 1970 model. It got 11 miles per gallon US. Okay? And one of my favorites, the General Motors Hummer. 1992 to 2010. Okay? 6.6 liters, 403 cubic inches, Duramax diesel. 9 to 14 miles per gallon US in the Hummer 1, right? They started making them smaller after that, but the first ones, they were the real ones, right? So I went back and looked at this chart. What do we see? The Mustang, RIP, 1973, right? Barracuda died 1974. The big block they killed in 1976. Super Bee, 1980. And the Hummer in 2010. It's not a coincidence. When the price of oil hit the roof, another gas guzzler dies. So what do we learn from this? High oil prices and high gas prices that go with them kill gas guzzlers. When the price of fuel rises, guess what? Consumers choose lower consumption. And the reason economists are all big on this is because we have drummed into it from day one the concept of diminishing marginal utility. I see some of my ex-students here, even bringing it up. Carbon taxes raise the cost of burning fuel. That's how they work. Carbon taxes can change individual consumer choices. For the more numerically inclined, I found a chart of price elasticity of demand for gasoline, and in the short run, it's pretty inelastic. They're pretty small numbers, but a lot of studies, there's a whole mess of studies that show in the long run, the price elasticity of gasoline is much higher, and it ranges quite a bit in these studies, but generally, it ranges from a low of about 0.71 there to up to actually minus 22, which is outrageously high, but generally the higher ones are around about 1.8 or thereabouts, which would suggest that in the long run you do get a consumption reaction to a price change in gasoline. So, would carbon taxes solve all of our problems? And there's been some discussion already about some of this. Well, first of all, it can't handle embedded carbon from outside the jurisdiction. There's some talk about that. It's one thing to tax production of goods and services in Saskatchewan or in Canada and to thereby pass on the pollution cost to the consumers of those goods and services. But if you can import the same thing from a non-tax jurisdiction, you've got a problem. Carbon taxes don't address other greenhouse gases, most of which I can't pronounce. But some of these are much worse than carbon dioxide. Fair point? But of all the options, carbon tax is the only one that affects individuals' behavior directly because you pay it. So it has that effect. Working on the presumption that if you're going to address climate change, behavioral change on the part of individuals is required, then that would suggest a carbon tax has to be part of the mix. One way or another, high emissions lifestyles got us here today. If this is a problem, this is how we got here. Lowering greenhouse gases is going to require a lower emissions lifestyle from everyone. Some are going to find that change to be challenging, shall we say. Perhaps they'll perceive it as a reduction in their standard of living. That's what's required.
course, I could continue asking questions, but I'm pretty sure that there are people biting their tongues who want to ask questions.